This is a bit daunting for me because I've never engaged in a conversation with a distinguished a speaker, or for that matter, any speaker. But we decided to...
Just think of yourself as Terry Gross.
My role here is to ask some questions. David will provide the answers. And I hope very much after half an hour or so that you all also can participate in the question session and let me off the hook. I'll welcome that a lot. So let me start with the focus of your book is on the market. Can you define what you mean by the market and its impact on higher education? And why has this phenomenon occurred now?
I'd be happy to. For the moment, though, as a professor, I always feel badly when people are sitting, on the floor and there are wonderful seats sitting around the room. So let me invite you guys to move on down from those back pews. I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to answer the question in part by reading the opening paragraphs of the book, just as a way of giving you a flavor of both what I mean by market and market forces and how it is that I go about telling this story. So the book begins with two headnote quotes. One from a European philosopher named Karl Jaspers, The Idea of the University. Jaspers says, the university is a community of scholars and students engaged in the task of seeking truth. The other from a fellow named Michael Crow, who used to be the executive vice president for technology transfer at Columbia, now is the president of University of Arizona. Michael quoted in an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education a couple of years ago, says, knowledge is a form of venture capital. So someplace between there, community of scholars and venture capital, is the territory of the book. So here's the way the book begins. The two campuses are a half-hour's drive and a psychological light year removed from each other. Between them, they mark the outer boundaries of the new higher learning in America. One is a modern rendering of the Ivied College, a place of learning set apart from the humdrum world. The verdant landscape, camouflaged from neighboring office parks, is a real park, dotted with ponds and meandering trails, a setting that invites conversation among students and teachers. The buildings are unobtrusively contemporary, and the classrooms, many of them seminar-sized, are wired for the electronic age. This is a highly selective school which draws its students and its faculty from around the globe. Students report that they are pleased with their education, as well as with the opportunity to make the kinds of contacts that make careers. The other campus is a faux Gothic refuge from a dicey urban neighborhood, Oxford amid the ghetto. But until recently, the telltale signs of neglect were everywhere evident, from the physics lab, state-of-the-art circa 1950, to the swimming pool used to train competitors for the Olympics. That would be the 1908 Olympics. Throughout its history, the institution has regularly been in financial trouble. Twice in earlier years, it came close to moving away, and its annual deficit, projected to run $10 million, was eating away at its relatively modest endowment. While its alumni have always been fiercely loyal, many were saying that the place was so brutal they wouldn't send their own children there. Attracting new students had become harder and harder. More than 60% of those who applied were admitted to the class of 2000, and fewer than a third of those who were accepted actually enrolled. The second of these schools is the University of Chicago. The first is Hamburger University, McDonald's corporate training headquarters. Now, to speak of McDonald's and the University of Chicago in the same breath is blasphemy, at least in Hyde Park. But the rise to prominence of schools like Hamburger U, not your parents' higher education certainly, but an accredited institution nonetheless, as well as the hard choices that confront a quintessential academy of higher learning like Chicago, illustrate a much larger phenomenon. For better or worse, for better and worse, really, American higher education is being transformed by both the power and the ethic of the marketplace. And that's the story that the book means to tell. The strategies devised to navigate this complex market terrain, as well as the values of university life that those strategies can place at risk. So to go back explicitly to the to your question. If we were to turn the clock back a century, we'd find that the most outrageous form of money-making distance education that fleeced students was being carried on by Columbia and Chicago through their extension programs. We'd find that there were companies, businesses, that had located plants on the campus of MIT, not so far away. We would find that Clark University, then a world-renowned institution, had been decimated by faculty raids conducted by the University of Chicago. And we'd also find that when the Carnegie Corporation sent out a business consultant to look at universities, he said there are all sorts of business practices that these places could be adopting, and darn it, none of them are doing so. So the reality, at some level, the reality of the market and the push to greater market values is an old story. I think, though, that what's happened in the last 30 years is so different in degree as to amount to a difference in kind. And we can talk about the why in a minute, but for a whole variety of reasons, the pursuit of support and the desire to reshape institutions so they can effectively compete in the marketplace has become a preoccupation of higher education. And more importantly, it's not just the pursuit of money and the attempt to function efficiently. The pursuit of money has always been a story in higher education, where otherwise the term legacy would not have a meaning specific to the academy. But what was once thought to be a necessity, you've got to raise money to survive, becomes a virtue. So, the University of California's recently retired president said the motto of this institution is the University of California means business. And indeed, it's the valorization, the pride of place given to marketplace, to the ideas of the marketplace as themselves sort of powerful moral forces inside the academy, not just the people raising money so that the life of the mind can go on inside the institution. That seems to me to be the heart of the change that I'm describing.
Why?
Why? Well, gosh, there are a whole variety of reasons. Let me start with one that's going to be most familiar to this audience, and that is a little-known news weekly, third among three, called U.S. News and World Report. I'll bet you there are a dozen people in this room who could tell me where Boston College ranks, maybe more than that, in the current U.S. News and World Report survey. I know that when I was talking to Joe, his shorthand description of the transformation of the school in the last 25 years used the ranking as the measure of that. And that's going to be true whether you're at Harvard competing ferociously with Yale and Princeton, or you're Indiana University of Pennsylvania creating an honors college to attract students away from Allegheny College, also in western Pennsylvania. U.S. News develops a ranking system whose importance it's hard to underestimate. Almost any place that I looked in academic life, I found examples of this. So when I was writing about law schools, for example, I was told by colleagues at places like University of Pennsylvania that they were urged by their deans to be nice to their students. So their students, when queried by the folks who asked these kinds of questions for the rankings, would say nice things about them. And so University of Pennsylvania, a law school that is probably someplace right about the top 10, could move up in those rankings. Now, in the early 1980s, and I needn't tell you how important those rankings are, because my hunch is that this being a highly selective and prestigious institution, most of you were looking to see where it is that BC was and how it stacked up to other places when you were thinking about where you'd go. Surveys of college students at the 20 top-ranked institutions found that in 18 of those institutions, students were asked, what persuaded you? What was the convincer in terms of where you went? Students didn't talk about faculty. They didn't talk about courses. They didn't talk about programs. They talked about prestige. And what do they mean by prestige? They meant the rankings. And universities, there's a critical moment, it seems to be, in higher education about 20 years ago, when the rankings, which play into the American desire to know what's best, right, to sort of have a pecking order in this institution. When universities might have said, hey, wait a minute, why should these folks in this magazine be deciding what it is that matters? Why can't we tell folks why it is they should come to our institution? And there was essentially none of that. Indeed, what there was if you read the view books for most colleges, you will find it very hard to distinguish the one from the other. The big university from the small college, the urban liberal arts school from the public urban university. They're all going to say the same kinds of things about themselves, and that's because very few people are writing all of them. And they're writing them in a way that is meant to attract students who themselves will add to the prestige of the institution, while at the same time not breaking the bank of that institution. So if you look to, if you want to know, so they're developed a much more ferocious competition, particularly for students with impressive academic credentials, because they would help the school look well on those rankings. And that in turn was going to translate into better students in the future, better faculty, more alumni support, bigger contributions, more grants, a whole bunch of other things. So that's one example of this story. The other is that academics, professors, started becoming stars in a variety of ways. In the sciences, and they began in significant numbers to produce things that were worth money, that had a market value. And it had been the case that research undertaken with federal money, the product of that research was common good property, belonged to everybody. And not much of that research was getting patented. And so in 1981, Congress said, universities, you can patent the stuff that you produce, even though you're using public funds to do so. So all of a sudden, potentially, university professors can bring in tons and tons of money. At those places that were most successful at this game, and that is that had lucrative patents, there were schools that bring in now, the top 10 schools in the country, generate more than $75 million a year in patent revenues. Columbia was generating $130 million a year. Now, to put that in some perspective, universities calculate that they can spend 5% of their endowment. That's the sort of classic sort of index. If you've got $1 million, you can count on being able to spend $50,000 of that money. It's basically a kind of conservative estimate, not so conservative these days, of the growth of the portfolio. So if you've got $130 million to spend, that's like having a $2.6 billion, billion with a B, supplement to your endowment. So there are professors who are worth money, potentially because they could bring in huge revenues, and there are professors who became kind of the academic equivalent of rock stars. And all of a sudden, is he going, isn't he going? Stories show up in the paper. I'm told that just in recent weeks, a couple, husband and wife couple from the African American Studies Department at Harvard moved to Stanford. And immediately, the Boston Globe calls up Henry Louis Gates, who is perhaps the most distinguished and certainly the best-known scholar in this field. And Henry Louis Gates had been flirting with the idea of leaving Harvard. He's left lots of places before. The first question is, are you leaving? Are you coming? Are you staying? It's kind of like, a sort of baseball conversation, right? The manager has been fired. Are you going to stick around with the team or not? And all this from an earlier round of conversations when a professor named Cornel West went through a kind of will he, won't he conversation that also goes on in page 1 of the newspaper. Professors become celebrities and sought after for their cachet status. Why? Because you have a Henry Louis Gates or a Cornel West on your campus. That's going to attract attention, buzz, resources, students, something in some sort of phenomenon that you hope is going to work and improve sort of where you are. The stakes, the market stakes are high, because I think the realization is in a world that's been described as a more the more world, right? To them that have, more shall be given. Right? The more the more. In that world, if you win at this game, then you wind up attracting, again, better students, more research dollars, more alumni support, faculty superstars. You get to become more selective. The story ratchets up, and others wind up losing out in this game. And it's clearly it's a hierarchy. Wherever BC is today, it wants to be 10 places up a decade from now. And that's true of every college and university in the country because of the high stakes that are involved.
Can we take a case study of this, which is admissions, which you discuss in the book? You point out that modern admissions strategies was actually developed
right here
by Jack McGuire. Some of us know him. He's now a well-known consultant.
I thought you were going to say paid.
How does this work, and what does it mean to the future of higher education in the market sense?
Well, once upon a time, there were just deans of admission, financial aid officers. We remember these times, right? Registrars, sort of, that's it. And it's really true that the birth of a much more complicated, integrated, managerially oriented approach, not just to admissions, but to the care of feeding of students from the time they're sophomores in high school all the way through their alumni years and then down to the point that we're talking about bequests. All of that falls under this sort of invented rubric of enrollment management. And Jack McGuire really is a pioneer in doing this. Now, in terms of attracting students, what the focus of enrollment management is the use of financial aid as a strategic tool. For most of the last half century, financial aid has been distributed on a basic Marxist principle, horrifying notion. It's been based on need. If you're poor, you get more. And those places that were rich enough to have need-blind admission basically said, we'll accept you, then we'll look at your finances. And those places that couldn't do this would say, we're going to provide as much money as we can to the neediest able students that we have. The strategic use of financial aid works on a somewhat different algorithm. It says, what we're going to try to do, our goal, is to maximize the number of students with high grades and high SAT scores and minimize our out-of-pocket costs. Minimize what is called in the trade the discount rate from the sticker price, otherwise known as the tuition, room and board figures that appear in the catalog. Now, preceding this and carrying on from this, schools that were concerned about moving up in the rankings started shifting funds from need-based aid to merit-based aid. That is, awarding money to students who would make the school an intellectually more impressive place, a place that would improve its standings in the rankings, etc. But the strategic use of financial aid takes the story one big step farther. It basically says, we're going to do fairly elaborate regression analysis, and if you want a full explanation of this, Joe Quinn will provide it for you after I'm finished. It basically says we can figure out how to use the marginal dollar of financial aid to attract the students that we want. What's the best use of that marginal dollar? Given that what we're trying to do is to be, as the language of the trade would have it, a revenue center. Given that the Admissions and Financial Aid Office is a revenue center, how can we attract the best students at the lowest cost? So what does that mean in practice? It means that systematically students from middle-class families with good grades in SATs and substantial family incomes are favored over poor students who might even have the same grades in SATs, but who have larger needs. And it's expensive to go to college these days, as you and your families certainly know. So it's not an outrageous notion to think that a family that earns $120,000 a year might say, if we're going to go to Boston College, and not to the honors college at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, we're willing to pay $15,000 a year for that privilege, but not $20,000. And I'm using Boston College entirely hypothetically. I have no idea how that formula works. So I'm using it really to tell the story in a more localized way. So that means is the families that are going to wind up receiving funds are those whose needs really are pretty marginal. So the school will save money by admitting them, and it will also improve the caliber of its students as measured by SAT scores and high school grades. Who loses in this world? Well, I've tipped off the end of the story. I mean, who loses are kids from poor families. And the downside of this story is that it exacerbates, it exaggerates, it continues a trend that's been going on for at least the last quarter of a century, which is that higher education really not only, I hate to sound, I really am not a Marxist. The only time I would produce this kind of a sentence in my life is at this moment. Not only replicates class privilege, it exaggerates class privilege. It widens the gap between the rich and poor. A survey of the top 105 colleges, 105 most prestigious colleges. That's pretty far down the road if you think about this. Found that 75% of the students come from the top 25% of the income bracket. 10% come from the bottom half of the income bracket. 2% come from the bottom quarter. And if you look at where those students attend school, you'll find that the students from that bottom quarter and that bottom half are disproportionately concentrated in mass public universities and especially community colleges. If I am the enrollment management vice president of any school, and somebody tells me this story, they're going to say, the response is going to be, there's nothing we can do by ourselves. We agree this is a problem. And I've talked to lots of folks in this world. Nobody would deny the reality of the problem. Nobody would deny even that the strategic use of financial aid affects that problem. But the response is, and everybody is doing it, and everybody is indeed doing it. So there really is a problem in which each institution is now caught in this web of the collective devise, and it's very hard for any place to figure out how to get out of it. But the macro consequences are really to make it even harder for poor kids to get to schools like this one. If you look at the data, one more little piece of data. Pell Grant scholarships. federal scholarships given to families with incomes below $42,000 a year. I'm happy to say that my home institution, Berkeley, is among the prestige institutions highest in the scale in terms of the proportion of Pell Grant eligible students enrolled, 35%. I use that as a benchmark. Harvard, and Harvard is only slightly worse than most of its competition. Harvard, 2.5%. The president of Harvard, Larry Summers, made headlines all over the place when he said, free ride to every student comes from a family earning less than $40,000 a year. Now, I was having a conversation like this at a meeting of the presidents of all the leading research universities, including Larry Summers, and I said, that's great. So if you take all of those students, you could fill a decent-sized seminar room at Harvard. That's about as many of those students are there. What are you going to do about that 2% number that's there? And he said, we're working on it. So watch those numbers.
Related question. The U.S. Higher education system is characterized by a lot of diversity. Diversity and prestige of institutions and purpose and so on. You've been talking mainly about the upper tier. How does the market affect the entire system? How does it percolate down? Are some parts of the system less affected by it than others?
Well, one basic distinction, that's the distinction in public and private institutions. And the second between where you are on this prestige ladder. 30 years ago, economists of education were worried about the future of private higher education institutions. The future of this institution was at risk. The future of New York University just hung by a thread. And public institutions were getting all sorts of generous support from the state. That situation has flipped around completely in the last 10 or 15 years because states have cut back on the proportion of the monies that public universities get to spend on students. So what was at one point 50 to 60% is now down in the 30, 25, 20, 18% of per pupil costs. So that state universities are scrambling to survive, and the flagship state universities to maintain their position with fewer and fewer dollars. Now, presidents of public universities no longer call themselves state schools. They call themselves state-aided schools, state-located schools, and a particularly dark moment, state-molested schools. And what's happening is that tuition at least at the elite private universities is rising so that it will approximate what the private schools are doing. Basically, those public institutions are becoming private institutions, depending on tuition and other income that they can bring in. So in order for those schools to compete, those public schools to compete with private schools, they start behaving more and more like private schools. Now, down the ladder, what happens? It's not as though, I mentioned Indiana University of Pennsylvania. It's kind of like what I imagine UMass Dartmouth to be like. It's definitely a regional college in the system. But Indiana University of Pennsylvania wants to move up its pecking order. So what does it do? It creates an honors college. Admits 150 students a year. Average SAT scores at the Indiana University of Pennsylvania Honors College, 1,325. Pretty amazing. What's happening to the rest of the 13,000 students at Indiana University of Pennsylvania? Don't ask. Not much. But what is Indiana University trying to do? It's trying to compete with Penn State's Honors College for those same students. And what is Penn State's Honors College trying to do? It's trying to compete with the liberal arts colleges in the Pennsylvania area for the best students in the Mid-Atlantic region. So every place along the ladder, almost every place, you find schools trying to fight their way up the ladder. The big public universities all want to be big research universities and play in that pool. The regional institutions, regional primarily teaching institutions, want to look better than their neighbors down the road. That's how the process plays out down the levels.
Is this a good thing or a bad thing?
Yes. When competition can be a very healthy development because it wakes up, among other things, it wakes up dozy academics to the fact that they really do need to make clear to students why they should be there. It also, can invigorate the research programs of major institutions. There's a danger in university life, as classically said in bureaucracies, in which professors have an easy time confusing what's in our self-interest with what's in the interest of the larger institution. That, by the way, is why in most schools core curricula have disappeared and you have free choice, essentially free choice of courses, sometimes with more or less worthless distribution requirements tacked on. The theory is this is what students want. The reality is it's what faculty members want because it allows them to pursue their own interests, and it means they don't have to come together and agree on what matters, on what you should be learning. The downside of competition, I've already suggested some of the examples of. A market is not interested in equity. I think that's the biggest downside. They're really, the market of higher education as such really isn't concerned about sort of what happens to those poor kids. To be poor, a working definition of poverty is that your choices are crappy. It's true generally across the board. I mean, that, in a world in which money is the coin of the realm, that's what it means to be poor. You have lousy choices. And I think the market is troubling in another way, and that is, if it's possible, not to romanticize the notion of particularly the liberal arts college and liberal arts programs, the idea that ideas matter for their own sake, that what you're trying to develop is critical and inquiring minds, that students who come to college really are acolytes who are going to learn, not consumers whose preferences are going to be satisfied. It's a very hard idea to survive. The idea that there are domains of academic life where money is not the coin of the realm, that seems to be very important if the university is going to carry on fulfilling its classic and continuing purpose of developing and transmitting knowledge. Markets can be very short-sighted. There's not much of a market in Scandinavian studies, or for that matter in theoretical physics. So if you look at the departments that wind up being shut down in places that are financially strapped, those are the departments that are there. One other problem with the dominance of the market, the growing dominance of the market, and that is it encourages the perception that higher education is a private good. That is to say, that it matters primarily to you. And it is a great investment. Again, 30 years ago, there were economists who were saying, if you just think about return to investment from higher education, it's not a great bet. You'd be just as well off not to go to universities. No longer. Turn something like 30%. People earn something like 30% more over the course of their lives with bachelor's degrees than with high school degrees. So it is a great investment. But if we start thinking of higher education just in those terms as a private good, all the public good aspects the benefits that you as engaged citizens provide, the benefits that you as inquiring minds provide to the rest of the society. All of that gets very little attention in what is being called by George Bush the ownership society. Just think about what that means. The ownership society is one in which private goods become increasingly dominant, and the notion that there's a public square that needs to be enriched just disappears from this story. And that's my largest concern. Not that markets ought to go away, not that markets are evil. I think there really is an important place for markets, but markets need to be kept in their place.
Can you say a few things about distance education, which you discussed at some length in the book? What's the current status of the development? Why has distance education, how does it fit into your framework? Why has some amount of distance education in the U.S. anyway failed so badly?
Distance education, by which these days we tend to mean internet-based education, although there are lots of other varieties. Sending somebody a packet of books and examining them is also distance education. But the internet is a wonderful tool, as we all know. Right? How did we live before Google or email? Well, that I think I can understand, but if I sift out my junk email. Along comes the possibility of making available to millions of people in quite sophisticated ways a lot of knowledge that heretofore has been confined to this setting. Look, there are 80 people here maybe in this room. Put this on the streaming video on the web, and lots of folks out there could potentially be exposed to this lecture. But it's a tool. And in the 1990s, some very distinguished universities, used that tool as a device to make a ton of money. They thought that, to use, again, some of the language of the day, that electronic sages on stages, or sages on electronic stages, I guess, would sort of pontificate, and the world would buy this product, and there they would be. Most of those universities were so eager to jump into this terrain that they never had anything that would approximate a market model. I mean, nobody asked the marketing 101 question. Who are you selling this product to, and why do you think they might want it? And so a place like Columbia loses $40 million. NYU loses $25 million. There's a very distinguished roster of institutions that got in and got out at various price tags. Other places use distance learning to put their ideas out for general consumption. MIT got a lot of wonderful publicity, and more or less deservedly wonderful publicity, when it said, we're going to put a lot of our course material on the web, and it's going to be there under the MIT rubric. Page one, news stories, 40 million hits in the first week on this website. Now, who knows how much of this stuff is actually going to be used, and it should be clear that what MIT has posted in this free source courseware, it's not a course, right? It's the sort of bones of something that someone who's teaching elsewhere can make into a course, or maybe some individual can try to figure out how to use. It's not for credit, but it's stuff that's out there. It's knowledge that's being given away. It's an old idea of the university. We're supposed to be giving away knowledge, not patenting it, not selling it. And then you get places like a number of liberal arts colleges that I write about in the book, a consortium of schools in the South, small colleges where classics programs have 3 or 2 or often 1 professor. And there's no way that they can really produce an adequate classics major for their students. And so they get together and they start using the internet as a way of sharing courses so that students at the same time are hearing and seeing professors from other corners of this of the South. And that, it seems to me, is the best of it, right? I mean, there you really are using this thing called the Internet as a tool for learning. I mean, one of the kind of underlying themes of the course is that all of the developments that I wind up talking about, whether it's managerial reforms or the financing of students or the pursuit of faculty or any of those things, can be done really brilliantly, or they can be done really terribly. And what distinguishes the brilliant from the terrible is that the people making the decision, whether the people making the decision know what the purpose of the institution is, know why they're doing something. There are two kinds of successful big university presidents, and I will leave them for the moment unnamed, although I do say something about them in the book. Both of them have raised $1.5 billion in endowment and counting. Both of them have really improved the resources available to their institution. One of them, in consultation with others on the campus, said, these are our priorities. This is what we want to pursue. We want to work in nanotechnology, we want to do urban studies work, and we want to do cross-disciplinary environmental studies. That's what we want to raise money for. And that president, that faculty went out and convinced very rich people that those were important things to do. The other president said, we need money. And he pursued as many different sources of funds as he could, and basically took the money and turned it into purposes for the institution. And so I would say that university, that second university, is less a university and more a holding company for various enterprises that operate. Now, I have real sympathy for that second president. His first year on the job, he harbored the lovely idea that he was an academic leader, and that fundraising was something that sort of followed from that, and so he'd spend a day a week raising money. And at the end of that year, he came within this much of being fired. The board that said to him, "Nuh-uh, you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing." And he learned a lesson, and it's a dispiriting lesson. Is that institution richer today than it was? A lot. Richer than its neighbors? Yes. Does it have some very distinguished programs? Indeed. Is it a university? Not in the sense that I would imagine Boston College is a coherent institution. It is not a university. Doesn't even have as good a football team as Boston College.
Thank you. I think it's time to move the discussion from me to you, and I hope you have some good questions. I think we can take about 20 minutes or so for questions and David's responses.
And I'll hang around whenever we're receptioning. So
hope that the reception will show up when we've asked it to, hopefully just outside the door here.
With apologies, I'm going to take my class to do half of our regular class time.
Ah. This will affect the room a lot. That's too bad, because this is the fun part of the story. Oh, goodness, it was almost an hour then. Almost an hour.
Yeah. Went very well.
I have much more fun doing this than I do.
Okay, folks, with apologies for those who are leaving and so on. Yeah.
I just had a question about like the market forces and what would you call unions in education, or like, K-12 education has a teacher union, and then you would criticize higher education for promotion and tenure as far as the unions, how the market forces impact educational system. Do you see that changing in the future at all? Do you see the market impacting?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Over 60% of new PhDs who go on the job market and get full-time jobs get non-tenure ladder jobs. So I'm not counting all those folks who can't get full-time jobs and get these part-time, freeway flyer, subway strap hanger, whatever you sort of want to call it, jobs. Universities are turning out many too many academically oriented PhDs. That's been true for a while. It remains true. And senior faculty at elite institutions have observed this phenomenon, basically, of the transforming of their profession especially in second and third tier institutions, if they've observed it at all, and have had absolutely no response to this. It's kind of like the United Airlines senior pilots, watching and saying, as long as we've got ours, it doesn't really much matter how you treat the newcomers on the block, except I'd argue that the stakes in academic life in this sense are higher in terms of what the future winds up looking like. So it's not a great surprise that unions have made substantial inroads, particularly in large state institutions. Because in a world characterized by space for free thought and inquiry and teaching aimed at promoting critical thinking, it's not a world in which the classic union model, which is all about job security and more benefits and the like, fits. But in the world, as it really is in much of higher education, where teaching loads are very high, and this is particularly true for the growing army of these part-time professors, these adjunct professors. An adjunct teaching, I'm going to make a pretty informed guess, an adjunct who's teaching the freshman writing course at UMass is getting $2,500 a year for a course. Maybe a bit less, but that's the train. Well, do the math, right? How many courses can that person teach? 4 a semester? Plus 3 during the summer? You gotta love teaching a whole lot, and those folks do, in order to be willing to put up with those conditions. If a union shows up down the road and says, look, we can offer you, a chance of greater job security through collective action. That's lovely. I'll tell you a personal anecdote. I was being interviewed for the deanship of the New School in New York City. Now, what you need to know about the New School is that it's a fabulously liberal place. It's a place so liberal that Ralph Nader would have been regarded as a sellout on the right. You can make an argument about that in any event, right? But certainly, the word John Kerry would not be uttered without the word sellout being attached to this. It's a place which has sort of never left 1968. That's the way to put this. So here's a school it's a school founded by a famous sociologist named Thorstein Veblen to educate the, quote, common working man to the same level of education as they'd receive at Columbia, the school that he'd left to go to the New School. So it's got a great pedigree. No tenure or tenure rank faculty members. Well, I've learned enough about this world, so that's imaginable to me. I can conceive of a world without tenure, but no full-time faculty members either. Everybody's an adjunct. What do you pay your adjuncts? I said, between $1,500 and $3,000 a course, they say. And I said, that's immoral. And remember, this is the liberal institution. They said, but that's what the market pays. And I said, that's exactly what Nike says when people complain about the sweatshops in Asia. You will gather that I'm not the dean of the New School standing before you here today. So I think that the situation is scandalous, and I'm going to add one other wrinkle to the story that's less well known. If you're an adjunct or you're on a year-to-year contract, you're not going to give low grades because to give low grades is to risk being unpopular. If you're unpopular, some student's going to complain about you. You're not going to assign a controversial reading, because if you do, some student is going to complain about you. And there's a line of folks out the door waiting for your job. So there's growing bits of evidence from cases that have come to the AAUP, the Association of University Professors, the academic freedom watchdog, that you don't have the institution saying grade high, don't assign controversial texts. You have the more insidious phenomenon of self-censorship. And that all is associated with a sort of part-time lack of job security. It's also as inconsistent with core academic values as you could imagine. Dr. Quinn.
You make the point in the book that one kind of oddity of this industry of higher education is that the students, who in some sense might be viewed in a business sense as the customers, are also, in an economic sense, a really important factors in production. In other words, the brighter your students are, the better education other students receive, because the quality of the classroom discussion is higher, the late night conversations are better, and so on. So it's hard to think of other industries in which the customer is also such an important factor in production. But given this, and I do very much believe this, I mean, how could a university not be competing for these students? I mean, this is what, if Boston College wants to provide a high-quality education, among other goals that we have, the higher the quality students we bring in, the better we do for all our other students.
Of course that's true. But the question is whether or not the metric of quality, and I made that point in describing why it is that our enrollment manager is going to behave the way he or she does. With a finite amount of money, if need becomes your only basis for attracting students, then those students from families with $125,000 a year aren't going to go to Boston College. They are going to go to the Honors College at UMass, and you lose those students. So this, to me, really does seem to be what economists call a tragedy of the common story, where everybody is acting in a way that is rational from the institution's perspective. And the losers are those who really don't have voices in that process. So poor, smart students are being systematically underrepresented in institutions across the board. I don't know what maybe you do know, I don't know what the figures are at Boston College of students who are Pell Grant eligible. But those are the students, what? 12%. Impressive. In this league, remember, 3 for Harvard, 12 for Boston College. That's an impressive figure. And by the way, among the competitors, that's an impressive figure. It's not Berkeley's 33%, but I'll take 12 as a number. It's those students for whom nobody in the market-driven world is worrying. And so what do we have coming out of Congress? I mean, not attention to those folks, not attention to the privatization of higher education, but pressure for universities to keep, public universities, to keep tuition down, because that's what constituents are complaining about. So what happens? How does UMass get those students that you're describing? UMass sends recruiters now out to New York and Connecticut and New Jersey and Colorado, where there's now a higher education voucher system, to pursue students who will come bringing out-of-state tuition with them. Well, for UMass, that's great insofar as you say, you improve the caliber of the students who are there so that the learning opportunities are better. What's the problem? Well, UMass is supposed to be a state institution. The historic compact is with Massachusetts. And the historic compact, and it's a funny state to talk about because Massachusetts is so far and away the school with the most kids in private schools that UMass doesn't occupy the same place in the pantheon as, say, University of Wisconsin or University of California, Berkeley, or Texas. It just isn't. It never will, just because of the historic relationships between public and private institutions. But the historic compact between states and their flagship universities is, look, you support us, will keep tuition low, will admit the best and ablest of the students in the state, regardless of how much money they have, will provide cutting-edge research and also perform a public service for the state in which we're located. That deal is dead. And that's the problem to me. It's not, if I were advising the head of enrollment management at Boston College, I would be saying, do more of it. You had first mover advantage, as they say in this world. You got there first, keep doing it. You're doing well by it. But I'd also say, go out and raise some money. Do what Tony Marks at Amherst is now doing. Go out and focus the attention of your alumni and others on the needs of those kids who can't afford under the existing metric to come here. Increase the numbers of poor kids. All of the attention in equity conversations, all of the attention is focused on racial minority students and on affirmative action programs that increase the percentage of racial minority students at elite universities. And those percentages have gone up significantly. 85% of American higher education is non-selective, or essentially non-selective. So we're talking about 15% of the schools. We're talking about maybe 3 to 5% of the students who are admitted on affirmative action criteria, maybe 8% of the students. Do the math. We're talking about maybe 10,000 students, 15,000 students a year who benefit from race-based affirmative action. I happen to like race-based affirmative action for a very pragmatic reason. It means I get a more interesting range of students talking to one another and to me. But 10,000 students, 15,000 students, whatever that number is, on the one hand, community colleges in California last year increased their fees from $11 to $18 a course credit unit. That means about $100 a semester. Sounds like, chump change. 150,000 fewer students than anticipated enrolled in community colleges. If you are a poor kid from a family that does not have folks who've been to college, you see the sticker price. You don't see the down-the-road investment. 150,000, 10 to 15,000. So, if I were to sort of turn the question back, I would say that focusing the institution's attention, the alumni's attention, drawing together with other comparable colleges to both raise consciousness and also increase opportunities for poor kids, whether minority or white kids, that ought to be the equity priority. And without any sacrifice and I dare say, an improvement in the quality of the conversations that go on inside the institution.
Well, although the topic here isn't VC and shouldn't be, it's worth noting that to some extent VC has done just what you advised, in that we are now, and just recently, need blind, which is a very expensive proposition, that we have raised the kind of funds to have tuition for folks who need that.
Right. And
it's not all great,
well,
some of it works better.
Sure. And when I hear 12% as opposed to 3 or 4%, you get a sense that it's working some. And again, it becomes an example so that people who sort of think about this is not just a conversation about them, about the stratosphere. It's also a conversation that I'm sure is going on here as well. And that's great news. I will tell you that at Amherst College, our alma mater, the president has gotten fierce resistance from the alumni when he has made this argument. Why? Because the alumni say, the more places that you reserve for those kids, the fewer of our kids can come here. I would be surprised if that same conversation weren't happening at any place that is reaching out quite deliberately to expand the economic diversity of the school.
Bob?
Could I push you a little further on the consumerist side of this? Because I think what you've talked about is marketing, and so the assumption is that institutions can be somewhat masters of their own fate, despite the fact that they're all telling the same story about the difficulties in pursuing their own fate. But could you talk about the consumerist side? In other words, perhaps colleges are not doing a very good job in marketing themselves, which is what you've told me, and they may default to using money and price sensitivity to affect people's choice. And you've talked about reputation being a driving force in people making their choice. I'm wondering how much reputation is a proxy for academic quality, because people really don't have any idea what academic quality is out there. And that the real challenge for institutions of higher education is to find meaningful ways of describing differences in academic quality among institutions, especially different flavors of academic quality.
I'd agree with your second premise and quarrel a bit with your first. When you don't know what academic quality is, you choose the places that other people like you choose. So the most recent data being put out by the National Bureau of Economic Research ranks universities in terms of what happens in head-to-head competition. How they got this data, I don't know, but it turns out that Harvard beats Princeton 95 out of 100 times. So whatever the rankings in U.S. News may say, Harvard winds up on the top of that set of rankings. This is, why does somebody go to Harvard College, having taught there for a while? I will tell you, it has much less to do with the quality of the education, which is decidedly uneven, than it does with the capacity to work with other very smart and very motivated kids while you're there, and to be a part of that large octopus-like network called Harvard. To the extent that there are, I think, in fact, people choose reputation because it has brand signal advantage out there in the outside world. And that's when they say prestige is what they want, as indeed they do, that's what they're saying. They're saying, I want to be credentialed by this institution. I think you're absolutely right. The more important point is that institutions need to figure out ways of saying what we are doing has, in economic terms, value added. You are better thinkers. You are sharper thinkers when you leave here than when you came here. You are more equipped to deal with the kinds of challenges that you're going to face in the workplace and as citizens and as people who are living in a world of a public culture than you were when you showed up at the doorstep. And I think that's an essential task for universities, both because it's what they are about, presumably, and because, although academics, including myself, are very fearful about what such an instrument might look like, 40 states now have accountability laws in the books that say, show us that what you're doing is worth our investing in. So public universities are going to be heading down this road, and by and large not heading down that road very well, because so far the focus is on retention. How many folks graduate in a timely fashion? Well, it's really easy to increase retention and graduation rates. You just raise the grades, make the product, dilute the product. It's easier for folks to respond to it, and there is some indication that that's what's happened. But there are now 100-plus schools that are participating in a study of a pretty elaborate instrument, a several-hour exam administered to freshmen and seniors. I don't know if Boston College is on that list yet, but 100 schools across the country. And the preliminary results, the hope of the people who organized this, frankly, was to say liberal arts education was going to be the best. Small liberal arts colleges would do the best. It turns out that the pattern, there is no such neat pattern. Two colleges that you think of as quite similar, if you knew about the schools from reading about them or from reputation, are quite similar, have very different results. So that now sends the folks who are doing this research out to the field to figure out what's really going on out in these places. Are they really similar? Their rhetoric is similar, but are they themselves similar? I think it's really important for universities to take the lead in showing that what they offer, has powerful intellectual, cultural, political engagement value. And that's a hard task, but I think that tsunami, which rolled over medicine, museums, primary, secondary schools, is about to roll over universities as well. And this is the moment in which it's really important for universities to be the masters of their own fate.